Good afternoon and welcome back. My name is Alyssa and I'm a second year's master's student at Parsons School of Design in New York, and I'm here today to talk to you about sound, particularly within the urban commons. So I live in New York City where Parsons is based, and if you haven't been, this is a view of the city from Long Island City in Queens. And this park is a really special part of Long Island City. It's a really diverse community, and it is an example of an urban commons. So, what is a commons? There are a myriad of definitions, but as Peter Linebaugh explores here, it is more about exchange. It is not just a place or the people, but the intermixture of them both. And humans and other species use urban commons for a range of different activities, and because of all of this mixing, they're constantly changing. The urban commons are dynamic. So it is not only limited to the physical things that we see, but is also expands to include other senses. And in this case, we'll explore the role of sound. So, what does the commons sound like? If you were to say what New York City sound like, what would you think? I think often a siren comes up, or the sounds of cars. But if you were going to talk about a specific commons, you might look at the corner of a street in Bed-Stuy and think of a time in the summer when cars roll by and people are blasting Biggie out of their sound system. This is the beauty of sound in a city. It is different for each person, but in the commons, these sounds tend to overlap and converge. With sound ethnography, we can begin to document, to represent, and to explore the unique experiences of the commons. So city sounds have obviously been explored before, historically by sound documentarians like Tony Schwartz and many architects and public policy practitioners. But these practitioners have looked at how space is influenced by sound, as well as how architecture can influence amplitude. So there have been few approaches onto how the role of sound is an integral part of the urban commons. Indeed, it is this public culture that is the most generative part in urban commons and so hard to capture. So what does a city with its multitude of cultures, people, and classes sound like? How does sound affect a neighborhood or a city's perception of itself? In which ways might we explore the future of a city development by focusing on how the future of a city might sound like? Can we collectively shape the sound of a city? So my research began to explore these questions and lines of inquiry, looking at conducting field recordings around different commons in New York City, interviewing people in practitioner positions as well as those on the street, and conducting ethnographic research to then compile and synthesize the data. Of course, it looked a little bit more like this, which is a little bit back and forth between the field research, the interviews. And through this research, I was able to explore around New York City, looking at not only the corner of Fulton and Nostrand in Bed-Stuy Stuyvesant in Brooklyn, but also the Green in Prospect Park, the steps of Union Square, and the Canal Street in Chinatown. Recording found sounds that added to a sense of place, but also talking with the people who experience these every day, learning from what they hear and what they experience and the sounds that they make as well. I also dove into specifics with practitioners in public policy and in academia, exploring how they view sound from both architecture and well as makers in certain spaces. Through all of this, there was a lot of sound collected and field recordings, hours of recordings in general, and my research really explored tagging and going through all of these, spending the time collating and collecting certain areas that express through audio certain commons and pulling out insights into this work. So whether that looked like Post-its on a board, pulling out certain highlights, or combing through different data and collating them into files that look like the audition here. Listening back, I was able to hear insights like this one about the unknown becoming known. or this, which starts to bring out the livelihood of certain places and practices of commenting. And through this compilation and synthesis, 3 themes started to emerge: sound, change, and interaction. With these, it became clear that sound was making tangible things that are not necessarily visible, and that the systems of commons began to be made apparent through sound. The first is fairly obvious, that each place has its own sound. And I think while obvious, it's important to note that this is an interesting finding because they might have overlapped in other ways. So each place not only had certain languages that they used, but had different birds and textures within these soundscapes. They also were actually representative of change. So not only gentrification, but also climate change. Whereas the park, you could hear when talking through academics, the idea of birds changing their songs based on their surrounding sound. The idea that gentrification is the changing of languages in certain commons. And finally, the idea of interaction. The idea that sound allows for a certain level of exchange that in commons where you might not find elsewhere. So the unintentional noises, the additional sounds of a city, whether that's sirens or bird songs, adds to the certain commons experience. So it's a bit hard to talk about this without actually listening to it. If you're interested in hearing it, these are all available online. I've taken these recorded and started culling them together into a podcast for each commons, which blends the sounds and interviews of the participants together. This is just a jump-off point for this research. This is the beauty of design research in general, and this project is just an outlet for that allows for these questions to be accessed by the public and to continue a conversation with them. So discussions around culture, urban planning, and civic engagement, and beginning to ask new questions about ways of exploring the role of other senses in the urban commons. It is this next phase of design research, and it also acts as a prompt to begin to speculate on how we might create and invent the city we want to hear. So I know that was quick, but it's just the beginning. And if you're interested to know more, I'm happy to chat at any time. Thank you.
Thank you. You took me by surprise. My microphone wasn't ready. Thank you for this presentation. Someone want to ask something to Alyssa? Yes.
Hello. Thank you for the really interesting project. I'm just wondering the mix of the interviews and the soundscapes when you're talking about that, and I started thinking, well, if I'm hearing interviews from New York, I'm going to start hearing some very interesting dialects.
Absolutely.
Did you consider that there's a sort of an aspect of a soundscape is also the way people speak, and I imagine it's something you'd remark in Montreal as well. So.
Absolutely. I think my choice of commons in particular was small in scope. This was a semester-long project, not a thesis, so I had a limited time for it. But I picked places that were very diverse in place. Bed-Stuy is one of the most diverse areas in Brooklyn. People come from all over, but particularly from Caribbean nationalities. So you have a mix of people from Jamaica and Puerto Rico coming together in one area. So you can hear it in their dialects and the style of music you hear on the street. And it's very different from what you would hear in Union Square, which is a bustling metropolis of tourism. And so you have different aspects of that.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. I was just wondering, when you did your field recordings, was there any protocol, or like how did you choose exactly what kind of recordings you would keep for your the editing at the end, like, and how did you manage to circulate in the neighborhood to choose what you would record?
Sure. So there's a difference between commons and a neighborhood. So I wasn't looking at Bed-Stuy as a whole. I was looking at very specific areas of exchange. So that kind of helped narrow down my scope because Bed-Stuy is massive, and the corner of Fulton and Nostrand isn't. And so from there, I actually spent a lot of time recording because you don't know what you'll capture. So I did have a lot of audio, probably more than I needed, but I thought it was essential to ensure that I accurately captured everything, and I didn't want to miss something that was vital. I think going forward, moving with this project, I would want to include people who live in these neighborhoods and commons to get what they think and what they hear. I think that would be a vital next step. So.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your presentation.
Thanks.
Maybe more of a comment.
Sure.
I would love to see, at least what your presentation brought to mind was the differences of how places sound.
Yes.
And then I think maybe your first or second visual was actually of like how sound, yeah. So like comparing the visual of how each place, like that as I don't know whether that would be like a language or just whatever, but like I think that would be an interesting thing to see.
Cool.
And yeah, thank you.
Great, thanks.
Thank you, Alyssa. I'm wondering, where do you position this work vis-a-vis some literature that has been addressing this topic? I mean, I can note, of course, Berger's seminal Ways of Seeing, Jay's Scopic Regimes of Modernity, and probably even other calls for ethnographic research to be more democratic as far as the senses is concerned, right? Towards the democracy of the senses. I mean, these are the kinds of things that come to mind. So I wonder if you're conscious of this literature as you do this work. I guess my question is, what's your take on the fact that the preoccupation with vision as opposed to something else, even when it comes to sound, right? I mean, when I talk to you, I say, do you see what I mean?
Yes.
So it tends to kind of overcome all other senses. I wonder, where do you stand regarding the fact or the hypothesis, the claim that in fact the preoccupation with vision is a necessarily Western and a necessarily modern way of perceiving the world?
Yeah, so obviously, as you've mentioned, there's lots of studies on this, lots of work. And for me, the interest was in exploring the different diverse sounds of these commons, because commons are not something you necessarily see. It's not about the built environment, it's about this exchange, it's about how people relate to one another. And so it's not visual in and of its nature. It's not, a park bench. It could be represented by a park bench, but it's not the bench itself. And so I was trying to find other ways to search and research about commons, and sound seemed to be an interesting way to do that. Now, whether that is Western or not, I haven't dug as deeply into that research as I might have or should have. But I think it starts to play into this nature of who do you hear, what do you represent and bring up into your research, and I tried to be democratize my sounds and get as many different types of people as possible, but I think there's always work to be done with that.
Any more questions? Okay.
Thank you.
Merci.